Welcome to a Scottish Human Rights Bill, putting rights into law and action, chaired by Lucy Mulvey from the Alliance. The speakers are Dr Shivali Environmental Rights Centre Scotland, Heather Fishkin, Inclusion Scotland, Mary Snowdon, Human Rights Consortium Scotland, and Alex Thorburn, Inclusion Scotland. This recording was made on the 10th of June 2021.
A very warm welcome to this afternoon's session about a new human rights bill for Scotland and putting rights into law and action. So I'm Lucy Mulvey and I'm the Alliance's Policy and Communications Director, and I'm really delighted to be chairing the session this afternoon. So the aim of this afternoon's session is to explore proposals for a new human rights bill, what this means for Scotland's people and society, and how people with lived experience, who are also sometimes known as rights holders, should and can be involved in securing this new law. And as many of our members and partners will know, human rights is an issue of great importance here at the Alliance and a core element of our vision, aims and work. I've personally been very lucky to be involved in some of that work, including some of the things that you'll hear about from our panellists. And I'm a big fan of international human rights, so I welcome any opportunity to spread the human rights love. I first cut my teeth on this issue around 30 years ago when I worked to help people navigate the UN human rights system in Geneva. And Scotland forges ahead with plans to become a more rights respecting nation. There's lots to do, but there's also lots we can learn from what others have done elsewhere. We're joined today by a fantastic panel of experts from across Scottish civil society who are going to share their views about a range of issues, including how to embed Scots international human rights in Scots law, the role that people can and should play in this, rights and redress, and what the new law could mean for our environment. Our panellists are Mary Snowdon from the Human Rights Consortium Scotland, Alex Thorburn, who amongst many other things is a member of the Scottish Human Rights Commission Lived Experience Leadership Group and the People-Led Policy Panel, We're also joined by Heather Fishkin from Inclusion Scotland and Dr Shivali from the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland. So before we hear from our panellists, we wanted to do something for a wee bit of interaction and interest, and we've got a one-question Zoom poll to see what you think. So could we put up the poll, please, Rob? The question is, will including international human rights in Scots law make a positive difference for Scotland's people, society and economy? And there's two options there, yes or no. We're being quite blunt with this one. It's not an entirely scientific or robust survey, this. I can see lots of you are starting to complete it. That's really fantastic. Thank you. That's great. Thanks so much. So Rob, can we see the results? Well, there we are. So 96% of people here today think that including international human rights in Scots law will make a positive difference for Scotland's people, society and economy. But there are some people taking part today who don't agree with that. So I think we're going to have some very interesting discussions when we go into our smaller groups. Thanks for sharing that, Rob. You can take that away now. I'm now delighted to introduce and hand over to our four panellists. And first up, we're going to hear from Mary Snowdon of the Human Rights Consortium Scotland, who's going to talk about a proposed new human rights bill in Scotland. Over to you, Mary.
Hi, good afternoon. So first of all, thanks to the Alliance and to Lucy for inviting me along today. I am totally delighted to be here this afternoon to speak about what I think are actually really exciting plans around a new Scottish human rights bill. So what I'm going to do in these 10 minutes is quickly really set out what the proposals are for the new law, why they're important and what needs to happen for it to really work well. Just to emphasise, though, from the outset, that if this Scottish Human Rights Bill gets passed and implemented, it will be the biggest single step that Scotland has taken to realise human rights for everybody. So we are talking about a major thing. So I'm just going to share my screen, always a nerve-wracking moment. I hope you can see that okay. So what are we talking about? Of course, we know that we all have human rights. We know that they're not luxuries. They are the basics and the freedoms that we all need to live our best life. They are internationally agreed, as in the UK has signed up to them. But currently, only some of these human rights are actually incorporated directly into our law. So there's only some of them that you can actually enforce in UK courts. So as many of you will know, back in 1998, the Human Rights Act was passed, and that put mainly civil and political rights into our law. So these are the rights around things like the big freedoms, such as like a freedom of assembly, of religion, the right not to be tortured, the right to life, the right to family life. And the Human Rights Act actually took the European Convention on Human Rights, ECHR, and incorporated it directly into UK law. That is not an EU thing, by the way, it's nothing to do with Brexit. So the ECHR and incorporated it through the Human Rights Act into our law. You might not always be aware of it, but actually that Human Rights Act protects you every day, protects all of us every day. Has been extremely effective. Every day, in particular, vulnerable people with no other way of raising their voice use the Human Rights Act in discussion with local authorities, with government, with the Home Office, and ultimately they can take cases to court because these human rights in our law. But of course, those rights are only part of the picture. They're only some of our human rights. As many of you will know, recently, with a unanimous vote, the Scottish Parliament passed a bill to incorporate children's rights, so the UNCRC, directly into Scots law. As Judith Robertson, the head of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, said, this act is the biggest step we've ever taken in Scotland to progress children's rights. So that was a major thing we don't have time to go into today, but that's now put children's rights into our law as well. But what about the rest of them? We have other human rights and we need all of them. And we need them not just to stick at that international level, but we want them to be brought home into our law. So as many of you know, and I know from that you have been involved in many of the discussions from seeing your names on the participant list, but in March this year, the National Task Force on Human Rights Leadership, of which I was on from the consortium, made a whole host of recommendations about a new Scottish Human Rights Bill and what should be in it. And significantly, the Scottish Government agreed to all of them. So the task force recommendation said that firstly, that economic, social and cultural rights, so these come from the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, big time, should be put directly into Scots law. So that is really basic things, sometimes called everyday rights, or at least the things that actually affect are very obvious in all of our everydays. Things like the right to food, the right to the highest attainable level of physical and mental health, the right to housing that is adequate, affordable and accessible, the right to education, that overarching right to an adequate standard of living. So really those kind of everyday rights, and put those directly into our law. It also said we should incorporate treaties for particular groups. So as I said earlier, we've already got the Children's Rights Convention in our law, and actually the task force recommended that also CEDAW, which is to do with women's rights, should be incorporated, CRPD on disabled people's rights, and CERD, which is rights related to race. All of these should also be part of our law, and that means for the first time you'll be able to use these and enforce them ultimately in court if it is not taken on board before then. But also the task force said that it is high time, and we'll hear more about this from Shivali in a wee while, it's high time that we also put the right to a healthy environment into Scots law, as well as particular rights for older people and around LGBTI rights. So you can see that these recommendations are huge. It also included lots of details around implementation, which I'm not going to delve into today, but I will, after I've spoken, put links in the chat box where you can read the full recommendations and find out more. So let me just, sorry, So without a doubt, this is hugely ambitious, very challenging, but also incredibly timely. So I'm sure we are all so very much more aware of rights restrictions that all of us have faced during our lives in COVID, but we're also more aware of the rights infringements that people have faced every day, and they just have not had what they need to live. And actually, we know from research that we recently carried out that actually many public authorities, so councils and health boards, didn't even consider the impact on human rights when they made COVID-related decisions. And that needs to change. But of course, we also know, and I know many of you are very aware of this, that for many individuals and groups, they've been living with rights infringements for years and years. And some of them we just take as for granted, some of them we've tinkered with, but there's been a lack of action, together with a significant rollback on rights at a UK level. So the plans for this new Scottish Human Rights Bill are incredibly timely and urgent. I'm just going to quickly highlight 3 impacts I think it's going to have, because that's what it's all about, is the impact in making rights real for everybody. So 1, it will change the way that decisions are made. So rather than human rights being an afterthought or an aside, that will start from asking questions about human rights and building them into budgets, into planning, into sort of big decisions, and into decisions that affect individuals. Number 2, it will empower individuals and communities to name and claim their rights. So often in my work, when I talk about human rights to people, they say it's the so what of human rights. So as in, people can mention human rights, bring them up in discussions, talk about policymakers, but the response is, aye, but so what? Because they're often stuck at that international level. And what we need is for them to have teeth and to actually make a difference. And that's what this framework can do. They literally will empower individuals and communities, as in give them power, and change that balance of power between the people who are making the decisions and the people that are affected. That doesn't mean that all of us will end up in court. That's not, you do need it to have the court option, but it will mean that actually it's a change the balance in terms of discussion and decision making between individuals and those who make the decisions. And thirdly, I think we'll start to see it really impact and grow a human rights culture. So a culture that actually says it's all about dignity and insists on asking that no matter whether a process or a structure or even a law was followed, has someone been treated with dignity? Are we doing enough to meet the needs of everybody, not just most people? Because everybody deserves to be treated with dignity. So that's some of the things that I think are really exciting actually about the potential impact of this new human rights bill, but it is not written yet. And we've got a long way to go. We're only at the start of the journey. There's loads of details to be sorted, both with the bill, but also with all of the stuff that must go alongside it in the implementation. And I know actually many of you have already been involved in some early discussions, maybe through All Our Rights in Law. We need more of that, and we need it all the way through the development of this bill and its implementation. So I suppose I'm just going to wrap up with some questions for you. I don't know who all of you are. I don't know if you're here as individuals and organisations. But I think the question is, like, what experience can you or your organisation bring to the table? How can you get involved in shaping this framework? Is there anything you need to do to be ready to engage with it, or to be in the right sort of place, to have the capacity to engage with that? If you're here as an individual, what difference might this framework make for you? What are the human rights crunch points in your life that you can bring and bring your voice to it? And so to end actually with one very shameless plug. So if you're from an organisation that's not a member of the Human Rights Consortium Scotland, then please do join us. It's free. It's really light touch. It just means that you can stay in touch with ways to get involved, ways to bring your voice to the table, to make sure that we don't just pass this bill, although exciting though it will be, but actually that it will be implemented and really brings significant change for human rights in Scotland. Okay, thank you for listening, that rapid fire through things, and I'll be glad to take some questions later on. Over to you, Lucy.
That was smashing, Barry. Thank you so much. And you did manage to cover a lot of different important bits of information there. I particularly like the fact that you're also asking questions of the people here today and I've put a thing in the chat saying that people can also post their questions for you, but I'll come to people as well during the Q&A section, and I think it is a really good opportunity for people to think about how they want to get involved, if at all, and how they could engage and how they could get other people involved as well. So I'm sure one of my colleagues who's beavering away behind the scenes to support us today as well will be able to put a link to the Human Rights Consortium website into the chat box too, so people can go to that to find out more about the organisation, including how to join. So thanks very much indeed for that, Barry. And I'd now like to invite our second panellist to join us, who's Alex Thorburn. Alex is a well-known to many people activist and campaigner, including amongst his current roles. He's a member of the Scottish Human Rights Commission Lived Experience Leadership Group and the People-Led Policy Panel. And Alex is going to speak to us today for about 10 minutes on how people with lived experience should and could be included in the plans for a new Scottish Human Rights Bill. Over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Lucy. Afternoon, everyone. Barry, how do you follow that? Okay, although I'm billed as being a member of the People-Led Policy Panel and the Lived Experience Leadership Group, I'm not officially actually representing them. So it could be said that these are my views based upon lived experience. No. I feel there are probably three main groups who benefit from having people with lived experience participating throughout the decision-making process. And in this instance, we'll deal with the benefits associated with the incorporation of international human rights into Scottish law that I know are so vital to all of us. So lived experience benefits the individual concerned, of course, plus public bodies, civic society, and wider communities. So firstly, I'll deal with the benefits for people with lived experience. Being meaningfully involved in participation, we feel valued for who we are, what we can provide, and that our contribution is not going to be wasted. However, fully inclusive and meaningful participation can also provide us with a sense of purpose, increased self-esteem, and enhance our experience within the decision-making processes. It can also provide us with the knowledge that we are being treated with respect, that we're being valued as a person, and we have valuable skills and experiences to add. As far as incorporation of human rights is concerned, it's even more vital that people with lived experience are involved from as wide a range of individuals and different communities as possible. And this will greatly enhance the process and, more importantly, the outcomes. Moving on to the benefits for public bodies, participation is not and should not be a one-time event within the decision-making process. The more meaningful the participation, the more likely people with lived experience will be prepared to become involved. Therefore, increasing the numbers, the diversity, and the range of views available to the public body concerned. However, for a decision-making process to be fully inclusive, the involvement of people with a lived experience is essential to the design, the development, the delivery, the monitoring, and finally, the assessment of the process. True participation is not about endorsing what's already in place. It's about trying to effect positive change. However, in order for that to be achieved, both positive and negative views must be valued equally. Although it's essential that people with lived experience participate in every phase, no matter which model of incorporation is used, the process is likely to be both lengthy and complex. Therefore, to ensure that they can fully participate, it may be necessary to provide them with support that enables them to do so. That support should be in place for every phase of the decision-making process and should be factored into planning at the earliest stage. The third of the three groups that benefit in having people with lived experience involved are civic society and the wider community. And the benefits for them include the feeling that it's worthwhile to take part in the first place, and the understanding that there's a degree of community ownership. Plus, it illustrates that inclusion, dignity, and equality are the bedrock of the incorporation process. And it also ensures that incorporation of human rights is relevant to them wherever they are in Scotland and from whatever their background. It also raises the awareness within communities that human rights are real to them and that they can be realised by everyone. Plus, it can strengthen the role of communities in policy change, in creating improved accountability structures within the incorporation process and more widely within public bodies throughout Scotland. Finally, the inclusion of people with lived experience throughout can show the strength and importance of their contributions for their communities. When I began, I mentioned the People-Led Policy Panel, and that's a co-production between Inclusion Scotland members and the Scottish Government, COSLA and other public bodies. And I've been a member since the project began in 2018, and we've been looking at the future of social care in Scotland, and this is what I would call a true co-production with these public bodies and organisation on an equal basis, because everyone who is a member of the People-Led Policy Panel has either experienced of receiving social care or a carer of someone who receives social care. The panel's work is centred on delivery of human rights, and in particular the right to social care. We strongly advocated for a human rights-based approach to Derek Feely when we met him at the beginning of the Adult Social Care Review, and we're pleased to note that when the review was published, that within its 53 recommendations, human rights was a major factor. Also, when we met with Derek Feely, our final question to him was, why does the review's expert advisory group have no one with actual lived experience of receiving social care? That kind of stopped him for a second or two, said he would look at it, no problem. And 3 days later, one of our panel was asked to join the expert advisory group, and Jim Elder Woodward fulfilled that role for us. So apart from being a successful co-production, the People-Led Policy Panel is also a great example of how lived experience can benefit the decision-making process. Finally, I come to the Scottish Human Rights Commission's Lived Experience Leadership Group. We began life as the Adequate Standard of Living Reference Group, which was part of the Scottish National Action Plan for Human Rights, and we were facilitated by the Commission. So we've been involved since 2014, and we proved to be quite successful in promoting poverty-related issues and the associated human rights. We delivered a number of briefing papers and responded to relevant Scottish Government consultations. One of the highlights for the group was to provide a presentation to the UN Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty and Human Rights when he visited the UK. However, last summer, the Commission undertook a governance review, and as part of that review, they discussed with us a change in the role for the reference group. This resulted in the closure of the group on the 31st of December and the formation of the Commission's Lived Experience Leadership Group, to which we all transferred on the 1st of January. The group has already been very busy, and we've provided our views to the Scottish Government's consultation on the Adult Disability Payment Regulations and to the Independent Human Rights Act review, and we'll be working on the incorporation process, and this will be one of the main areas of our focus for some time to come. The future incorporation for the rights of the child, economic, social, cultural rights, and persons with disabilities into Scottish law, amongst others, of course, will keep us busy for a long time. As with any group, we don't always agree with one another at every point, but what we do agree upon is that the value that we bring to the decision-making process as people with lived experience. However, now as part of the Commission, our role has greatly expanded and to encompass all human rights, and that's a huge ask of any group, let alone one consisting of half a dozen people. No matter how committed we are to the human rights agenda, therefore we'll be recruiting a number of new members with lived experience and from different backgrounds to join the group to fill those gaps. That in itself is a success story for lived experience. However, the job's only partly done, because we now need to show the full value of lived experience within the Commission and to become an exemplar of good practice for other public bodies to follow. Post-COVID, there's going to be opportunities. And I think that one of the main opportunities is to do things differently. And public body engagement centred on human rights-based approach is definitely top of my list. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's always incredibly interesting to hear about your work and so informative to hear about your perspective and that of the people that you're working with, other rights holders, people with lived experience, about how to get in and about some of these important decision making. And I'm really struck by the mixture of reasons that you've given for why bother getting involved, and particularly that idea of not just so that it would engender a sense of ownership and make sure that any new law is going to be relevant for the people for whom it is designed to support and further their rights, but also because it makes the law better. So thanks so much for that, Alex. We're now going to hear from our third panellist this afternoon, who is Heather Fiskin from Inclusion Scotland, who's going to talk to us about routes to accessible justice for rights and redress and what they should look like. So many thanks, Heather. Over to you.
Thank you. Can I start with an apology? We are one of these people who got a puppy during lockdown, and he's just discovered how to bark. So whilst I've been on mute, he's been barking away. If he starts barking while I'm talking, I do apologise. There's no one else home to tell him to be quiet. Thank you so much for having us along today. It's really great to be here. Such a great turnout and such an important time in Scotland's history. And I'm going to talk a bit, and it might actually respond to some of the recent chat in the comments section, which is about access to justice. Things go wrong. There's no doubt about that. We have noticed this more than noticed it during the pandemic. You know that 6 out of 10 deaths to COVID in Scotland were disabled people. And that's not just because of, as the newscasters always say, underlying health conditions. It's also because of people not wanting to go in for treatment, people being denied the support because we're on the shielding list, social care being withdrawn, people being left without any social care support, people telling us they were sleeping in their wheelchairs for days on end, and still being charged for that social care support, so they couldn't use the money in other ways. Now, had the law that Mary has been telling us about been in place, then things may very well have been different. So one thing I would say, though, that any piece of law is not a magic wand. It is not going to make everything perfect the day after it's passed. However, when it bears its teeth, what it needs is for us to be able to use that law. And that goes for when our human rights have not been protected, when they have in fact been denied. So the first part of that is obviously that we need to have access to accessible routes to remedy. And that's something that the task force report made several recommendations on, and I'll copy the task force report, though I think it might be on Human Rights Consortium Scotland website, but just in case I can copy it over to the chat afterwards. And there's some really good recommendations in there, but what could be in that law regards routes to access and routes to remedy and restitution and to cease and desist, to stop it. And I think it's really important to emphasize that this can be strategic. So it might be one local authority that gets taken to court, but that case law has to be used more widely. And we recently did a survey on where disabled people were going for legal advice and legal services. 72% of the people who responded to that survey told us they had experienced barriers to accessing these services, lack of information, lack of expertise and understanding within the advice and legal services, lack of advocacy and support to access and use services. Because let's face it, being a disabled person can mean that you lack the time, the capacity, the skills and resources. You need these services to be accessible. You need them to have the expertise and to understand the specifics. And you need communication support. You need the right attitudes. And you need these advice centres and legal services to have the capacity, there it goes, to have the capacity to deal with demand. Excuse me, I'm going to have to shut the door and hope the best. Apologies for that. One of the other things is that on us, we have to know and understand our rights. And that's where the projects in the third sector come in. We have so much to do. And with must hold a mirror up to ourselves. Is there more that we could be doing to help people to understand their rights and what it means in practice? We all have everyday lives. It becomes mundane, obviously, in various ways, where we face the same small piece of discrimination every day, which is accumulative in its impact. We have to recognise that that is a denial of rights, and how we actually get to remedying these rights. So what is needed? And the task force report does say that routes to remedy and redress must be accessible, affordable, timely and effective. They actually have to have an outcome at the end of them. And we need awareness of our rights and what this should mean in practice so that we can actually challenge when they have been denied. Article 8 of the Convention on the Rights of Disabled People says that governments must raise awareness of legal rights. Well, if they're going to be doing that, they need to be doing it with us. Back to Alex's point about our involvement. They need to be doing it with us in co-production. And the one thing I would say about co-production, and this also applies to all the surveys and polls and work that was done, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, people were saying, stop asking me questions, just change things. It's about sharing the power. There's no point in being passive consultees all the time. We have public authorities, government must share that power. So we need fair complaint mechanisms. Going to court shouldn't be the first thing that people have to do. There should be open, accessible, solution-focused complaint mechanisms. And these should follow what's known as the panel principles, which I don't really have a lot of time to go into, but the human rights principles about how public bodies should be doing things, including participation, accountability, etc. And again, I'll copy a link over on that. Another one is around commissions and ombudsmen, such as Scottish Public Services Ombudsman, that they too should play a part in this. They should be working with us to find out where they should be shining their scrutiny spotlight. And again, it should be about about outcomes and not just about outputs, about solutions. And the task force report says that both complaint mechanisms and scrutiny bodies should have specific duties on them. So this new piece of legislation could actually put specific duties on these type of organisations so that they are monitoring public bodies to deliver our rights. And there should be advice and advocacy. And I'm speeding up a bit here because I know I'm running out of time. One of the other things is that Scotland is a nation we're quite averse to litigation. We're not keen on taking legal action, all kinds of reasons for that, and not unique to disabled people. If you look at England, there's a wealth of case law that people can use and say, oi, Mr. Local Authority, Mr. Public Body, Mrs. Public Body, look what happened in this area here. They got held up for it. You're doing the same thing to me, pay attention. So we're working with Just Right Scotland, which is a human rights-based law firm, and they have a Scottish Just Law Centre, a hub which is looking at disabled and trans people's rights and trying to take strategic cases, which they can then, if successful, share the learning from them. One of the things that happened recently, one quick example, was that we were contacted anonymously by students from a university in Scotland to say that they had had their extra exam time cut. Now, everybody was given extra time for COVID, and this university decided, well, you've got the extra exams time for COVID. You don't need the extra impairment-related exam time. They were terrified. The exam started on the Monday morning. They did not want to go to the university with their name because they were scared of repercussions, and that is an issue that needs to be addressed. So what in actual fact happened is that they would not take legal action, but they did accept a legal template, a letter, and they wrote to the university, and hey presto, Monday morning, the extended exam time was reinstated. So that is a way that the law can work. It puts pressure on public bodies. They do not want legal action, and/or they just don't want it. But let's hope it doesn't always come to legal action. Let's hope that the duties in this new legislation build on what we've had for years with the Disability Discrimination Act and then the Equality Act and the specific duties. And I know somebody said in the chat that we've been asking for things for years, nothing ever changes. Let's see if we can get this one to work. This has great potential. And I'm ready to work with who's ever ready to work with us and to work alongside everybody. And I hope that the co-production and lived experience sees a sharing of power that we've not experienced before. Thank you very much. I'm going to mute myself before Charlie barks the house down.
Thanks so much, Heather. And we welcome puppers at Alliance events. So if there's any opportunity to see the wee Doug at any point, I'm sure we'd like to do that. And thanks so much for your, again, as with our other panelists, very timely intervention there. And we'll certainly try and share links to all the things. And if you want to use the chat yourself to share the links to all the things that you've referred to, I'm sure there will be plenty of people here today who are particularly interested in the Scottish Just Law Centre work. And I would ask people, please do use the chat function to share your comments and links. We're particularly interested in your comments and links about human rights incorporation and about proposals for a new human rights bill here in Scotland, and about how people can engage in that process itself. And please do use the chat to post links for our panelists as well. I particularly like one of the common threads that's running very much through everybody's presentations so far, and I'm sure will extend into our next one as well, which is the desire to work together collaboratively towards achieving all of our common goals around human rights. So without further ado, I'd really like to invite our last, but by no means least, speaker up this afternoon, Dr. Shivali Fifield from the Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland, who's going to talk to us about the human right to a healthy environment. Over to you, Shivali. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you to all my previous speakers. Hello, everyone. I'm Shivali, and I'm the Chief Officer for the newly established Environmental Rights Centre for Scotland, or ERCS for short. And I'm going to cover some of the things that I've already spoken about, and Alex and Heather, but I think that's a good thing. I'm going to tell you more about our human right to a healthy environment. And with the global climate and nature emergency, plastic pollution, and COVID-19, well, I hope it's kind of obvious, isn't it? But perhaps what is less obvious is the importance of this right for everyone in Scotland, and why including it in the Scottish Human Rights Bill is pivotal to enabling all our human rights. So at ERCS, our vision is of a Scotland where every person's right to live in a healthy environment is fully realised. And I want to begin by reminding us about the extent of environmental problems in Scotland and the disproportionate impact they have on marginalised groups and places. I'll then summarise the opportunity that incorporating the human right to a healthy environment gives us, but also the need to really follow this up by supporting our policy and campaigns work to ensure it has the teeth to really strengthen our rights. And this is something that Heather and Vari have already spoken about, and Alex. And I also want to finish by explaining how to access our free legal advice service so that you can exercise your existing environmental rights for health and justice. And this picks up on Heather's point about action now. So let's begin by reminding ourselves of the significant, or what we call substantive, environmental problems in Scotland. And these tend to be worse in areas of high deprivation, which are where the majority of polluting factories, landfill, incinerators, and other environmental burdens are located. So the impacts on place are air, water, and noise pollution, proximity to derelict land, much of which is contaminated from past industrial uses. And across Scotland, there has been a reduction in local authority spending on environmental and park services, almost 30% in some areas. And this impacts street cleansing, road services, environmental health, green space management. And that, unsurprisingly, coincides with a decrease in environmental quality. So we see more litter, we see more dog fouling, we see graffiti, we see fly tipping, we see poor green space that we feel too scared to walk into. And of course, all of this can influence rundown places becoming sites for antisocial behaviour and consequent perceptions of our safety. There is also spatial inequality in access to green space and nature for play and well-being. And I think we all really understood that during lockdown. We now have extensive body of research, a wealth of understanding which emphasises the psychological and the social importance of access to green space for nature, green space and nature, for both our individual health and social cohesion. If we have nice places to meet, we go outside, we meet, we take pleasure and resources from each other. So these are the impacts on place. The individual cost is that the effect of environmental health hazards are felt disproportionately by children, the elderly, and people with existing health problems. So the poor environments we live in contribute to the inequalities in health for marginalised groups, including disabled people, women, and people from Black and minority ethnic communities. And we also know that these groups are often more socially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, such as severe weather events, because we often have less resources at our disposal. For example, access to insurance for flooding or less support networks for respite. So this is what we mean by distributional environmental injustice in Scotland. And in all my conversations with groups with living with the impacts of polluting factories, living with road traffic fumes, derelict land with no safe space for outdoor play or just being, it is the anger and despair of always being forgotten. Or as Alex says, being used for consultation, but never seeing any actions to ensure a safe, clean and healthy environment for them and their loved ones. So what can we do about challenging these examples of environmental injustice? How do we exercise our rights for environmental protection, for our health and the planet's sustainability? Well, there are laws and treaties to say that we have the right to access environmental information and participate in local planning decisions. And we can use complaints procedures if environmental regulations are breached. And as a last resort, as Heather says, we can take developers and polluters to court, can't we? Well, unfortunately, it's not as easy as that. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the environmental mess we're in. We know that marginalised groups plus socioeconomic disadvantage are furthest removed from participating in local decision making. We're often less aware of our rights or simply have less capacity and resources to implement them. We're just too busy dealing with everyday life. And access to the courts has been ruled as being prohibitively expensive. So you see, the same issues you face in seeking social and political justice are replicated in accessing justice on the environment. The outcomes that we see is that there is poor enforcement of planning and nature conservation law, and this covers environmental regulations and protections. Because of the significant barriers to public interest litigation, there is no credible threat of a legal challenge, and that credible threat is important to encourage enforcement and the rule of law. And the consequence is the destruction of the environment and nature. In Scotland, over half of our species have declined in the last 50 years, and 1 in 9 is at risk of extinction. And all of this hinders our obligations to address the climate emergency. And this is what we mean by procedural environmental injustice. So I hope this gives you an insight into why incorporating the human right to a healthy environment in a Scottish Human Rights Bill is so important, and why ERCS worked closely with the task force. And we were delighted and relieved to see recommendation 2 to include the right to a healthy environment with those substantive and procedural elements in a new statutory framework. So yay, it's included. And if it's done properly, it will provide us with the additional armoury to help tackle the climate and nature emergency, and for all of us to work together for a just and green post-COVID recovery. For the first time, our substantive right to a healthy environment will be protected in law. And as Vari and Heather said, this is crucial. You know, the United Nations defined the substantive right as right to clean air, safe climate, access to safe water, healthy and sustainably produced food, non-toxic environments, and healthy biodiversity and ecosystems. It also means that we have opened the gate to press for more legal reform to ensure fair, timely, and affordable access to legal remedies to advance procedural justice. Loads of opportunities, but our job is not done. We still do not have clear government sign-up to the right to a healthy environment. And we are pushing for this, and we will succeed. But following from this, we still need to work with public bodies and you to shape how this right is established and ensure effective implementation. So this is my plug. Please support our work to strengthen our environmental rights. And you can go to our website to get all the nerdy details, even more nerdy than I've just given you, and join our mailing list and become a supporter. In the meantime, we are here right now to support you to put your existing environmental rights into action. You can get free legal advice from our in-house solicitor, who's called Ben, and you can complete a simple advice form on our website. Environmental law means land use planning, climate change, pollution control, environmental health, nature conservation, and anything else that impacts on the natural environment in Scotland. So that could be road building, that could be energy. If you're not sure, contact us. Ben will respond to you within 3 working days to offer a Zoom or telephone appointment to get further details. So this might be an inquiry about how you access information, whether a public body like Scottish Water has done something unlawful, or how you can influence or challenge a planning decision. Ben's role is to support you to understand the law, explain your rights, and advise you on how you can enforce them. So I hope that was helpful, and thank you for listening. In summary, deprived places and marginalised groups have unfair environmental burdens to contend with. There is not enough awareness of our existing rights, and there are barriers to exercising them. We need a human right to a healthy environment enshrined in Scots law. ERCS is here to provide free advice to advance environmental justice, support us to ensure everyone in Scotland can live in a clean, safe, and healthy environment. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Shivali. Yet more food for thought in there, and a very interesting and considered presentation. And again, I'll have colleagues, and I'm sure yourself, Shivali, you can share links in the chat function there to all of the things that we refer to. And I'm sure people will be very interested to go and look on the website for more information about your work, for more information about the right to a healthy environment, and certainly your legal support service. So thank you, panelists. You've all done a tremendous job of covering a heck of a lot of detail in a short period of time. I really now like to ask you, the audience, if you have any questions for our panelists. The first question in particular, I'm sure all of our panelists might have something to say on that. How do we make sure this isn't just more repeated promises?
I think absolutely. I hear what you're saying, and I think we're all sick, fed up of laws passed, nothing changes, new policy, nothing changes, same old rights infringements. That is why we need to work together on this. We need voices of people with lived experience. We need civil society being on it and pushing for the details and details of implementation. We need to work together. And I think particularly important is we get access to justice right. So I think if we get that right and we make sure that the law actually has teeth, then not only will it have an impact when it's passed, but we can make sure it has impact in the future as well, to continually push for change. I don't think there's any easy answer, and I share that sentiment, and many people do. We don't just want this to be a nice thing or like nice principles, best practice. That is not what this is about. It's about human rights made real with enforceable, empowering rights. Yeah, so I live in hope, but also kind of aware of the fight and the challenge ahead. I
mean, I share Sarah's frustration. I'm sure we all do. We've gone down years and years of legislation, policy change, supposed culture change that never really actually makes any difference to anybody. And that's due to lack of accountability. And this is what must be built into the incorporation and the new human rights law is a true accountability. I hear this all the time when you're talking about human rights to people. Well, it doesn't make any difference. Nothing ever changes. You can't do anything about it anyway.
I'll be speedy on this one. I think one of the biggest issues with all the promises that have been made in the past is that we do have some really good legislation and policies in Scotland at a national level, but how these are played out locally on the ground, in your home, in your communities is a different thing. And I think that's where the action therefore has to be. We can tell ministers to the cows come home that the difference between their policy intention and what happens in the ground, but we need more action on the ground, and that's where we have to collectivise, come together, co-production and collectivise.
Yes, Heather, I absolutely agree with you, and I think both the accountability and access to justice is about us working together, bringing test cases, as you were saying, Heather, as well. And I think, similar to Just Rights Scotland, working with Just Rights Scotland to bring test cases on infringement of rights for disabled people and trans people, but also work with us to bring test cases for access to justice on the environment. But the more we do that, the more we learn and the more we give evidence the need for reform.
Thanks so much, everyone. Before we close, we've got another wee Zoom poll that we thought we'd like to hit you with. Rob's put that up there. So if you all want to have a wee go at doing that, are you going to get involved in the work to put international human rights into Scots law? I can see people starting to take part there now. I'll just give it a few more seconds so that everybody's got a chance to take part. Are you going to get involved in this work? Yes or no? There's no half measures when it comes to the Alliance. It's just much easier to do a yes or no poll, to be honest with you. That's great. Could we see the results now then, Rob, maybe? Well, there we go. 100%, everybody's getting involved. Woohoo! What a great result. Love it. Absolutely love it. Thank you so much, everyone. Well, all the organisations that have spoken here today, including the Alliance, HRCS, the Environmental Rights Centre, Inclusion Scotland, others that are here too, we're all going to be getting in and about it with this agenda. So we will try and make sure that we are making ourselves as accessible, inclusive, participatory as we possibly can when we come on to do all of that work. So we want to take as many people with us on that journey as we can. So can I just close by thanking our panelists once again. Thank you so much. I so appreciate you taking the time, as I'm sure everybody else has done. Can I thank our BSL to English interpreters and our digital note takers? And can I also thank my Alliance colleagues who've been beavering away in the background to help not just deliver this session, but the whole annual conference. There's an awful lot of unseen work that goes into creating an event like this. It's rewarding, but it's tough. So I think there are going to be lots of lions on Saturday morning. So I'll just say a final thank you, everyone. Please take care and stay safe, and see you at another event soon. Bye.